Welcome to Patricia's Potpourri. And as you know, you can get this episode and previous episodes of Patricia's Potpourri on YouTube. I have a super special guest for you today. This super special guest is a concerned citizen. He is Vinny Gaglione.
Patricia, thank you for inviting me here today. We go back a long time.
And one of my dearest friends who is always informed about everything, we talked about something called the Constitutional Convention. And she usually knows so much about it, but she did not know. So that's how come I had to get someone who's really in top of the situation and informed. So thank you so much for being here, Vinny.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
Okay. Vinny, there's talk of a question on back of our voting ballot in November about a constitutional convention. Is that true?
Yes, it is. If you look at the New York State Constitution, because we're not talking about the Constitution of the United States, but rather the New York State Constitution, there is a provision in it for changing the Constitution. It can be done in two ways, and the Constitutional Convention is one of the ways that it's done. The New York State Constitution states that every 20 years on the ballot will be a question put to the voters: should we have a state constitutional convention? It's been done something like 13 times previously since 1777, and this, I believe, will be the 14th time that it's on the ballot. And so it's a question that's put to all the voters, and as you said, it's on the back of the ballot. Our ballots here in the state of New York usually have all of the candidates on the front, and then when you turn it over are the various questions that we are supposed to be voting on. In this case, the question about the Constitutional Convention will be Proposition 1 on the back of the ballot. So you and I, as concerned citizens, are here to remind people, first, make sure that you vote on Election Day, and second, when you do vote, make sure that besides voting for the candidates on the front of the ballot, you turn the ballot over and vote on the questions in the back, especially Proposition 1. And between you and me, we're here to say, vote no on the Constitutional Convention. Vote no.
Vinny, we belong to the same union, the UFT. What's our position on that issue to vote no?
As a union, the UFT is in opposition to having a constitutional convention for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the New York State Constitution deals with education. Education is a state responsibility, and the New York State Constitution has a number of provisions in it about having public education. We want to make sure that public education is protected and does not become the victim of interests that would like to in any way change it. Second of all, we are workers for the state of New York, in essence, because we work for a public institution, the New York City public school system. And as such, our working conditions and our benefits, such as our pensions, are also protected by the New York State Constitution, and we want to make sure that those benefits, that those protections for our pension remain intact.
Are we the only group opposed to a constitutional convention?
How much time do you have? Because there are so many groups that are opposed to the Constitutional Convention that if we rolled them on the screen now, there would be no time for the two of us to have our faces on the screen. But what I'd like to do, if I may, I'd like to mention some of the groups that happen to be opposed right now to the Constitutional Convention.
Please do.
They are, for example, the New York State Conservative Party, the Council of Churches, the Citizen Action of New York, the Environmental Advocates of New York, Equality New York, the New York State Alliance for Retired Americans, the New York State Professional Firefighters, Planned Parenthood, the Empire State Division, the Right to Life, the New York Republican State Committee, Strong Economy for All Coalitions, the Working Families Party, the New York State AFL-CIO, to which both you and I belong as retired members of the UFT, and they include prominent unions such as NYSUD, AFSCME, UFT, DC 37, PEF, the New York State Public Employees Federation, 1199 SEIU, and just one more to complete this list, but not the total list, the New York State Farm Bureau.
You know, I'm very surprised about this list because I see even in this list who there are usually opposing forces, and they have even come together to say no.
You're absolutely right, Patricia. This is a broad coalition of interests who all realize that opening up the New York State Constitution in a convention can lead to damaging results for the state of New York.
You know, sometimes the most informed people can not know exactly. Like, what is a constitutional convention? What is a constitutional convention?
Well, if, and we hope it doesn't happen, but if New York's voters were to say yes to a constitutional convention, what would happen next is there would be an election for delegates to that constitutional convention. Now, some of the people in favor of a constitutional convention keep saying, well, you know what we need? We need ordinary people elected to the Constitutional Convention. But let me ask you, who do you know who has a job that is able to give up the job for however long the Constitutional Convention might go along and give up their job in order to be an elected delegate?
So that means that if you become a delegate for the Constitutional Convention, you cannot be employed wherever you are.
Well, you can be employed, but what job do you know that will let people leave their job to go off to do a constitutional convention and then come back to it? It's not the reality of the workplace.
Please tell me more.
So the delegates to the Constitutional Convention are paid. They are paid the same salary as New York State legislators earn. There is also pension credit, which in actuality, to go back to my first point, in order to get elected, you need to be known. And to be known, you need to spend a lot of money to make yourself known. And so, as has happened so often in the past, what usually happens during constitutional convention delegate elections? The same legislators that we have in Albany now run to be delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And so it becomes, in essence, people having double salaries. And in fact, there are other ways to change the Constitution other than through the Constitutional Convention. When the Constitutional Convention is completed, and there's no time limit to how long it can be done, when it's completed, they propose to the voters of the state what they're recommending to be changed in the Constitution, and then that vote takes place, if it's done within a year, in the next election.
Wow. That means that people who have who has jobs, there'll be a way, and if somebody is a politician, they'll be away from their political job for that a period of time?
No, what can happen is that they can arrange for the Constitutional Convention to occur at times that the state legislature is not in session.
Mm-hmm. Wow. How important is that issue for most of us, the issue of a constitutional convention?
Well, there are so many pieces of the New York State Constitution that would be at risk, in addition to what I explained earlier for you and for me in education. For example, one of the things that we have in New York State is the issue of social welfare. The New York State Constitution mandates that the state provide aid, care, and support to the needy. It declares that the state has an interest in the health of the people and care of those with mental disorders and defects. We do not want that kind of language changed. We want to make sure that we continue the obligation that we have to those less fortunate than the rest of us and those who are mentally ill.
What you're saying is any form of higher society takes care of those less fortunate.
Yes. The state, part of our taxes go to provide for those individuals who are less fortunate than the rest of us. That's something that's in our Constitution. Another example of what would be at risk, New York State has a wide expanse of state parks. And those state parks are protected in the New York State Constitution from being used for any reason other than the enjoyment of the people of the state. So we have a lot of people here in the Bronx, people in New York City, people around the state who go camping, who go fishing, who go hunting. And they do it in New York State parks. On the other hand, the Adirondacks has a huge state park. And there are logging interests and mining interests that would very much like to be able to get access to the parks, to get access to those resources for their own commercial interests. The New York State Constitution says they can't. And we want to make sure that it stays that way. And finally, to go back to the principle of education, the Constitution says that New York State's responsibility is to provide a free public education to every child in the state. There are those who would like to limit the liability of the state to take care of those responsibilities. And we certainly do not want interests to harm the public school children in the state of New York.
Lots to be considered. So how does the New York State Constitution get changed except through a convention?
There is another method to change the Constitution. And for those of us who perhaps enjoy this pastime, casino gambling is one of those issues. Right now, people in the state of New York are able to go to racinos to gamble. And that's because a constitutional amendment was passed, not through a convention. It was passed in the other method that the Constitution provides for. The issue goes before the state legislature, gets passed in one session, gets passed again in the succeeding session of the state legislature, and then goes to the voters on the ballot, and the voters decide whether they want it or not. And that's what happened just not so long ago, that we got the change to the Constitution that allows casino gambling in the state of New York.
Wow. So, what you are saying to us is the risks of a constitutional convention are greater than the potential advantages.
Yes, and I didn't even totally speak of all the risks that some of us face. For
Well,
example,
Could you speak of a few more risks?
Yes, I can. For example, housing. According to the New York State Constitution, Article 18 affirms the authority of the legislature to provide and prescribe the terms and conditions for the development of, quote, low-rent housing and nursing home accommodations, unquote, for persons of low income. Now, there are certainly, in the state of New York, a lot of housing real estate interests that would prefer not to deal with that issue.
You know, I have a story in which I'd like to tell. And I was going by West Side Highway, and we made a left on 30-something Street. And there were some construction men up on the scaffold, and we were stuck in the light because we were going east. And these men said, here we are building houses that we can't afford to live in.
And that is a major issue here in the city of New York, to be sure. Here in the Bronx alone, the cost of housing is tremendous. The mayor himself has spoken of the need to provide low-income housing, more of it, here in the city of New York. And it's something that the state constitution says that we must have. Now, you know and I know, with all of the real estate interests in this city, it becomes advantageous if you don't have that kind of provision in the state constitution. So we want to keep the state constitution the way it is. Let me give you some other things that may be at risk that, how shall I put this? You and I as seniors would be more interested in. For example, the New York State Constitution has provisions against age discrimination. We were able to work as long as we worked because the state says you can't get rid of us because of our age. The Constitution also gives us the right to an absentee ballot. So those who are disabled, elderly, and not able to get out to vote are able to apply for an absentee ballot, fill in their ballot, mail it in, and their vote gets counted. And finally, the state constitution, as I spoke to previously, gives us the assurance of nursing care in the state of New York, because the Constitution says that they must provide for health and nursing care.
There's something you just talked about, the absentee ballot.
Yes.
Think about those people that are away defending our country. They would not even have a right to a...
No, absolutely. They have a right to vote, and I am not exactly sure, but I do know that there are organizations that help provide absentee ballots to them while they are in service. So I believe that those who are serving our country do have the right to vote via the absentee ballot.
They have the right to vote now, but if it didn't go right with the Constitutional Convention...
Oh, well, then it's something that could be lost, absolutely.
Wow.
Well, just think of all the people sitting at home, too elderly to be able to get out. Otherwise, they would be disenfranchised as well. In terms of the absentee ballot, just for informational purposes, if there's anybody who's listening who can't get out to vote, it's very simple. All you need to do is to contact your county board of elections. The Bronx has a board of elections. Manhattan has a board of elections. Brooklyn has one. Staten Island has one. Queens has one. Call them up. Ask them for a ballot. It will be mailed to you. You fill out the ballot and you mail it back with, hopefully immediately, and within 7 days of the election, and it will be counted.
Wow. I really appreciate having you here.
Well,
Do you
thank
have
you.
any more opinions or more information about?
Well, I think that some of the other things that need to be said is you and I are union members. The New York State Constitution gives us the right to join a union. And that's something that we as workers want, not just for ourselves, but for all workers in the state. There are a lot of anti-union interests out there.
Being a part of a union is protection. My father even stressed that way back in the day. I know that you divide and conquer, and that's really a part of St. Philip's of Macedonia. You divide the people, you conquer. Okay? And if you're not a part of a union, you can be picked off very easily.
That's very true.
Then you don't have collective rights. Together, you can stand.
As you and I can both attest from being in the New York City school system. The system is better because we have had a union that is standing up for not only ourselves, but the interests of the children and communities in which we work. The fact of the matter is that in education, we are faced with a lot of people who misrepresent what's happening in our schools. For example, the funding of our schools. The New York State says that it must be responsible for the funding provided to schools. And what has happened in New York State is a lawsuit took place to win for the city's schools the proper amount of funding that they hadn't previously been given. And as yet, the state still hasn't provided all the monies that New York City schools are entitled to. So
I'd like to ask you a question. Is that the DeGrasse decision?
I'm not sure that that's the name of it.
Okay.
And to be honest with you, now that you say it to me, I'm at a loss to remember.
No, there was something about certain neighborhoods weren't getting their adequate funding.
Well, certain schools weren't.
Schools,
the
yes.
school systems weren't getting adequate funding. The big city schools in New York State don't get the same level of funding that other communities in the state get. So New York and Yonkers and Buffalo and the big cities. And that's a lawsuit that was filed and we won. And yet the state has not yet totally given to the school districts the total funding that we're entitled to.
Well, I got to say, I wish I could have you here for at least 10 more shows, but it's almost our countdown time. I want to thank you.
Patricia,
Thank you, Vincent Gaglione.
I want to thank you because what you're doing here is an important service to our community. Get out and vote no on the Constitutional Convention.
I hate to go on, but it's time to wrap up. But you know what? I hate when people say, this is not a big election, so I'm not going to vote. Don't people realize that it's these smaller local elections that dictate what's going on in your community? So the big elections, it's going to happen anyway, but it's the small elections that are so important to your community. You should personalize it.
Absolutely.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Patricia.